you're going to marry somebody, you should know who you're marrying. You know, what the legitimate thing you should do. It's what my wife probably should have done before we got married, and what most spouses should do, right? You should get a credit report, make sure that, they're not super involved in debt, or at least if they are, you know what you're getting yourself into. And maybe even getting a tax report, and we'll talk about that.
To the Moonlight Real Estate Side Hustle and Syndication Show. I am your host, Eric Lindsay. Here at Moonlight, we choose to focus on achieving financial security through real estate. Today's guest, Carlos Samaniego, is a renowned tax resolution expert, speaker, and founder of Tax Debt Consultants, LLC, a best-selling author and host of the Tax Consultant podcast. Carlos specializes in resolving IRS and state tax issues for self-employed professionals and small business owners. Without further ado, welcome to the show, Carlos.
Thanks for inviting me, Eric. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. You've got a really exciting topic to speak about. I'm sure if we started getting into the numbers, it may not be too exciting at that point, but every one of us have had some dealings with the IRS, and it's never fun dealing with those guys. And to hear that you specialize in fighting the IRS is really exciting, and it's really interesting to meet someone that is basically on our side. And so before we get into those details, if you could share a little bit more about yourself and also how you got started in the business that you're in.
Oh, absolutely. Again, I kind of, as you said, I deal with the IRS on a daily basis, and it's one of those occupations. People say, "How in the hell did you get involved dealing with the IRS?" That's like my number one fear. People always say the number one fear is speaking in public. I think the number one fear is dealing with the IRS. And the way I ended up doing this, believe it or not, Eric, is I went 8 years in my 20s, basically, not filing my own taxes. I literally owed close to six figures between IRS and state tax debt. And, and it's not one of those things that you planned, Eric. I always tell people, you don't wake up planning on having owing the IRS tens of thousands of dollars or not filing your tax returns. And mine goes all the way back again into my early 20s. I ended up becoming got out of the Army, ended up becoming an ambulance guy, a paramedic, the ambulance drivers, EMS workers. And I was sitting there in an ambulance with the older guy. I'd always say it's the older guy. The older guy was like 20 years old. I think I was like 19. And he was asking me, well, why are you working so much? Because I was doing a lot of overtime, right? And I was just trying to make some extra money for Christmas. And he's like, hey, Carlos, you know what? You don't work so hard. If you just take your paycheck, claim 10 exemptions, you're going to get a lot bigger paycheck, especially with all this overtime you're doing. And, millions of people actually do that. They try to go exempt. That's basically what it's called. And I ended up owing a whole bunch of money. And that year when I tried to file, so because I didn't have the money to pay them, I actually didn't file the return. Well, make a long story short, I did that for 8 years. And, I got used to that big paycheck and started spending the money, increased lifestyle. And 8 years later, here I am not filing my taxes. And then, believe it or not, it still took close to 10 more years before even the IRS, in my situation, it wasn't the IRS, it's the state that finally got a hold of me, and they started questioning me, hey, where's your tax returns? And unfortunately, I had to deal with it. And I really didn't deal with it until I made one of the biggest, had the biggest blessings in my life. I was no longer in the ambulance business. I was actually a real estate lender. At this time, I was working at Chase Manhattan Mortgage as a real estate loan officer. And I met a client that was trying to buy a house. But instead of buying her, helping her buy a house, I ended up getting married to her. We met, got engaged, we got married. And I did the total scumbag move, Eric. I actually married her and never told her I had tax problems. And what ended up happening is that she ended up marrying into my tax problems. And People always ask me, well, why didn't you tell her? Well, we know why, because she probably would have just left me. But after I married her, I literally started looking like, who can help me with this problem? And I ended up finding a local guy. He was an enrolled agent. That is exactly what I am, licensed by the federal government to help people resolve tax problems. And he told me, Carlos, you're a good guy. You just made a dumb decision, but we can fix this problem. And I'm like, well, I haven't filed in all these years. I owe all this money. He's like, we can fix the problem. We just got to put a game plan together. And fortunately for me, that we ended up fixing the problem. And me and my wife, she was happy. And quite some time later, after by this time I was out of the real estate industry, 2008, the whole implosion. I left the real estate industry, and I was trying to look for a career change. And she had actually said, "Hey, why don't you do what that guy did for you?" And his name was Ernie. And I go, helping people with taxes? He goes, yeah, because he had actually put that word, those small words into my ear. I think you would be really good at this work if you ever decide to make a career change in your life. And then back in 2015, I decided to start studying, ended up passing the enrolled agent exam issued by the federal government. And we co-founded the company Tax Debt Consultants to start helping people with their tax problems. So that's what we do today. My wife is the co-founder of the company, and we actually help people that are dealing with IRS issues.
Yeah, well, that's a really good thing because there's a lot of people that's struggling with tons and tons of debt when it comes to the IRS. I know myself personally that I got into a little bit of trouble a while back and it came back to haunt me. And so I had debt piling on top of debt. And because of some bad business decisions, it came back and it just mounted up on me. And so my story is I ended up getting into a really large transaction. So it was like $125,000, but it was the largest amount of money that I'd ever made, all in one setting. And I started building a business and was bringing in tons of income. I wasn't setting adequate amounts of capital to the side for tax time. And when tax time came around, I wasn't quite ready to pay that bill. And so it just mounted up on me. And so for those type of scenarios, what do you recommend for people that do find themselves in tax trouble and maybe have set up some type of payment plan with the IRS? Is there any loopholes or any ways to work around that?
Yeah, anytime I'm dealing with a tax problem, Eric, I always tell people, I don't care how big your tax problem is, whether it's a $10,000 problem, $100,000 problem, or a $10 million problem. The thing with tax problems, and most people that are in tax problems, they really don't know how big the problem is or what the problem really is. Especially if you've gone like years not filing, or it's been years since the debt that you initially got was assessed to you. How much do I really owe? And a lot of times, even the letters the IRS send you, when they do send them, get confusing because they might have 1 year. They send you a letter thinking that, oh, I only owe $10,000, and they're thinking they owe 100, but then they realize that 10,000 was just for 1 year. So the first step that I always deal with, I always tell people, before you can solve a problem, you have to know what it is. Kind of think like a doctor. Me having a medical background, I think of, when you have a problem, let's just say you have an extreme headache, and you're like, I don't know, what's this headache? What's going on here? Well, you don't call your doctor and he doesn't say, show up for brain surgery next weekend, because he doesn't know what's actually happening. And that's same like a tax problem. What does he say? We need to get some blood labs and x-rays done. That way we can kind of get a baseline of where you're at, what's really going on internally. Same with tax problems. I tell people, when you got a tax problem, first thing I'm going to do is file a power of attorney with the IRS. That way I can get complete access to all your internal records with the IRS. And most importantly, that way you don't have to talk to the IRS, because I don't want you talking to the IRS, making things worse. So let me be your in-between. So once I do that, I'm able to find out everything that's going on. We can literally look at all your tax history since you started filing taxes, usually 1990 as far back as I go. And we're looking at everything. We're looking at how much money do you owe? How much tax was assessed? What's the penalties and interest there? When does your tax debt expire? A lot of people don't realize tax debt does expire. You know, is there penalties and interest that need to be that can be abated? What tax returns haven't been filed and which ones should we file? Believe it or not, you can go years of not filing, and the IRS doesn't want every year filed. They only want a certain amount of years filed for you to become compliant. So once we know that information, just like a doctor, once he can see the blood labs and x-ray of what's actually going on, now we can figure out, once a doctor knows that, now he can come up with the treatment plan. Same with me. Once I see all this information, and then I collect a little bit more information from you, I'm like, I can come to you and say, okay, Eric, here's what's happening. This is exactly what's happening. This is what they're trying to do to you. However, now we need to go to step 2, because with the IRS, if you owe a lot of money or have unfiled tax returns, if you were to pick up the phone and call the IRS to deal with that, they may tell you, we can't help you because you're not compliant. What does that mean? You know, and that's what I call our phase 2. Phase 2 is becoming compliant, because the IRS, as much as they want to help you, they can't help you if they don't know how much money you really owe. So they want to make sure you filed all the taxes that they need, which is typically only 6 years. As long as you filed the last 6 years of returns, and most importantly, you're not going to owe any more money the following year. So if I was looking at you today, Eric, I'm looking at what's the next tax years. It's going to be 2025, believe it or not, because the 24 returns are getting ready to get filed, right? So we're going to make sure that in 2025, when you file taxes, you don't owe any money. Because ultimately, the IRS says, if we're going to help you with the past due taxes, we want to make sure you're not going to owe future taxes. It's just becoming compliant, because why deal with the past due if you keep on owing money? That's a real critical thing that they're looking at. So again, we've already started. We know what the problem is. We got you compliant. And now that you're fully compliant and you're not going to owe any money next year, here's what happens next. The IRS has multiple different options available to you. It may be an installment agreement for some people if you're capable of paying back that money. It may be that you don't even have the ability to pay back what they need you to pay back. So there's a thing called a currently not collectible, where the IRS will literally just shut off collections because you don't have the ability to play. The other one is the offer and compromise. That's kind of what you hear on the radio, settle for pennies on the dollar. That is a definitely the legitimate option. However, you have to qualify, and there's some pretty strict qualifications on that. A lot of times the people on the radio and television make it sound like they're giving it away like candy, and they're not. And typically I can tell somebody within about 10 minutes whether they may be a good candidate for that. So those are just 3 major options. There's a couple of more options there. What you don't want to do is get into what I call an installment agreement that you're going to default on. And sometimes the IRS will stick you in something like that. Like if you call them up, and let's just say you have a $70,000 tax debt, and depending on how old that tax debt is, that might be a very large installment agreement. It might be $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 a month, depending how old the tax debt is. Because the older the tax debt gets, the bigger the monthly installment agreement becomes. So, and the IRS may say, okay, we need you to get into a $4,000 installment agreement, and you agree, but you will know internally, I can't afford a $4,000 installment agreement. And then that's where I come in and actually sit there and go through the finances to make sure it's a legitimate installment agreement that you can really afford to pay back.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just as you said, being like a doctor, triaging the situation, being able to look at exactly where a person is, that's definitely going to put you in a much better position to identify and spot some opportunities to be able to help your clients out. So that's a great explanation. Before we went live, you were telling me about some other potential situations that real estate investors really need to be aware of, especially if you're looking to get involved in partnerships with other individuals and other real estate investors. And you were saying that it's really important to know the person that you're looking to start investing with. And the reason being is because sometimes they could come to the table with tax problems that's really not noticeable, or it's going to take some really in-depth assessing to be able to identify if this person is in some type of tax trouble or has some tax issues. If you can, just speak about that and share what are some potential dangers when it comes to partnering with just any and everyone.
Absolutely. It's almost kind of like the story I shared with you, right? You're going to marry somebody, you should know who you're marrying. You know, what the legitimate thing you should do. It's what my wife probably should have done before we got married, and what most spouses should do, right? You should get a credit report, make sure that, they're not super involved in debt, or at least if they are, you know what you're getting yourself into. And maybe even getting a tax report. And we'll talk about that. And kind of what I was mentioning earlier, a lot of people don't realize that back during the beginning of COVID, around 2020, the IRS literally, because of COVID, the federal government told the IRS they needed to back off on collections. You know what? The world's dealing with an epidemic. We don't need to be chasing after them for past due taxes. So Congress, the executive branch in Congress, they actually created a bill, a rule that stopped sending collection letters and stopped doing liens, levies, and wage garnishments if you owe past due taxes. So for 4 years, literally up until this last 2024, no liens were, in most part, liens weren't filed. The IRS made no attempt to collect on any debt. So because of that, here's what happened. There's millions of people. In fact, I believe it's 22 million people that owe the IRS up to $1 trillion worth of tax. It's a huge number, and my numbers might be slightly off, but I'm kind of going off memory here. All I know is just there's a lot of money owed in taxes. And when you typically owe money in tax, here's what happens. The IRS has the right to file a lien against you. But because of this COVID rule, no liens were filed. And another thing a lot of people don't realize, with most federal tax debt, liens are not placed on your credit report at all. So, let's just say, as an example, Eric, you're going into business with somebody, and you're trying to do your due diligence, and you pull that credit report, and hey, great credit, but there's no tax liens on there. So that's the last thing that you're thinking about, right? So now all of a sudden, you guys partner up, you go purchase a real estate investment property, everything's hunky dory, and then next thing you know, you find out 6 months down the road, because literally the IRS, as of 6 months ago, started saying, going forward, we're going to start placing tax liens. So 4 years of tax liens that weren't filed, they're going to start filing federal tax liens on people that owe money. So you're in this partnership with this individual, and all of a sudden, it comes time that you guys want to refinance a property, maybe to go do some other investment deal, and then there's a $500,000 tax lien on somebody, $70,000 tax lien on somebody. And then you're going, well, wait a second, now you can't refinance until you pay off the tax lien, or you're trying to sell the property and you can't do nothing because there's a tax lien. So the question is, well, how do you find out whether somebody is going to have a tax lien? Well, what I'm starting to suggest now, if you're planning to do any type of investment property with somebody, you should make sure that they actually get a report from the IRS showing their history of any past due taxes. Remember, you can't really we were talking about this earlier, Eric. Well, can a title company kind of do a title report to see if there's any tax liens? Absolutely, they can do that. But the problem is, if the IRS hasn't done it for 4 years, they may owe millions of dollars, but there's no tax liens actually filed yet. So we actually provide a service where we can actually do a report for somebody and give them a report back to 1990 to actually see the tax history of the individual. Is there any past due taxes? Are there any old liens that we don't know about? So you can actually use that as part of your due diligence. So that's the thing that I'm really concerned about. And I think a lot of real estate investors are going to get surprised here over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just being able to have access to that type of data and that type of information in which a person is able to assess and evaluate and do some diligence on an individual that you're looking to go into business with, because that will 100% be detrimental if a person has significant taxes that they owe and it causes you from being able to exit a property. That's really going to impact the business plan. And so you always want to make sure that you're doing diligence on the person that you're looking to get into business with. So I think that's a great service that you guys are offering. Carlos, You've been a wealth of knowledge. Your service that you're offering for fighting against the IRS, helping us as the investors, helping us as individuals that have to pay taxes and deal with the IRS is, it's amazing. If someone wanted to connect with you and learn just a little bit more about how to work with you, is there a preferred method?
Yeah, you can always go to my website, Tax Debt Consultant. That's my company website. And the other thing I recommend, and this is an offer for all your listeners. I wrote a book, How to Make the IRS an Offer They Can't Refuse, which I'll be sending you a copy of that, Eric. So make sure I get your mailing address. But your readers can get this electronic version. If you go to taxdebtbook.com, you can get a free electronic version there. It sells for, I think, $13 on Amazon. But again, it's free if you just go there, enter your email address, and then we'll get you that book.
Okay, Carlos. Well, once again, you're offering an outstanding service, and we'll love to have you back on the show anytime.
Sounds good, Eric. Thank you for having me.